Douglas Blackmon is the Atlanta bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal, who's written extensively about race and American society. His new book is called Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. Douglas, nice to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start with the obvious question. What do you mean by re-enslavement?
I mean the return of slavery. It wasn't the same thing as, exactly the same thing as what we all learned about in school about antebellum slavery, but the reality of what happened was that after a time of real freedom for blacks after the Civil War, a new slavery began to come back, engineered by many people whose economic interests had been built on slavery before the Civil War. And by the time the 20th century started, there were thousands and thousands of African Americans who had been returned to some kind of slavery and millions of others who lived in fear of it.
Let's go back down that timeline. So the date line that I want to start with, date line just after the Civil War. What's the conditions?
Well, immediately after the Civil War, like we've learned about Reconstruction. We know that blacks held political power and blacks were voting all across the South. But a lot of the story rages of crime and waves of misconduct all over the South, and that was an explanation for why the white South had such a violent response to African Americans. But the reality is that's not true. And in the course of writing Slavery by Another Name, I went back and dug through courthouses after courthouses in Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, and found the original arrest records of thousands and thousands of people. And the truth is that in many places in the South, I would find there were no crimes at all being committed for months and months at a time, and then suddenly there would be 15 or 20 or 30 young black men rounded up in the span of a few days and then sold under this perversely cynical judicial system that was emerging. They would then be sold into a form of slavery in coal mines or timber camps or sawmills and turpentining stills, and that happened to thousands and thousands of African American men.
But if slavery has ended, then how, because of crime or alleged crime, does one get sold into slavery again?
There are really two things happening. One is that all of the southern states, because the South was addicted to forced labor, and that's something that you really have to get your head around, is that, the economy of the South couldn't operate without coerced labor. And so whites in the South were insistent on reasserting some sort of control over black labor all across the region. And so all of the southern states passed laws which essentially made it almost impossible for a black man to be secure from arrest at any given moment. There were laws passed that made it was a crime if you couldn't prove you had a job at any given time. It was a crime to change employers without the permission of the first employer. So if you worked for a white man on his farm and you wanted to get a better deal with a different white man down the road, if you tried to do that without the permission from the first man, you could be arrested. And if you were arrested for these incredibly flimsy crimes, many of which were just fabricated and almost all of which were declared unconstitutional later, a man who was arrested under those circumstances would be fined $10 or $20, but would then also be charged the cost of his arrest. He'd be charged a fee to the sheriff, a fee to the clerk, a fee to the deputy who served a warrant, a fee to the witnesses. All of those things would add up to $100 or $200 that he would have to pay for his fine. Hardly any indigent black man in 1900 could do that. And so instead, to pay those fines, he would be turned over to a private enterprise, a white farmer or a coal mine or a sawmill that was where the owner was willing to pay those fines in return for a year or 2 years or 5 years of labor. But in the beginning, that might have been a somewhat legitimate system, even though the crimes were largely made up. But what began to happen was that this created a market for young black men. And soon, there were black men simply being kidnapped off the roadways and sold for $40 or $50, and there was no means or effort to prosecute whites for doing that.
So the court system had no honest way of dealing with this, no way to broker this situation.
The court system was central to it.
Right.
The court system had been perverted. The southern court system had been perverted to become a vehicle for exactly this. Now, there were exceptions. There were times in 1903, there was a fairly valiant U.S. attorney in Montgomery, Alabama, who attempted to prosecute some whites for trafficking in slaves and holding slaves. But the reality was it was nearly impossible. No white jury in the South would convict a white man for anything related to this, but also an amazing irony that I discovered while writing the book was that while slavery was unconstitutional by the 13th Amendment, there was no federal statute that actually made it a crime to enslave someone. And so there were times when a white man there would be an effort made to prosecute him for holding someone under peonage, which is debt slavery.
Right.
And his defense would be, I wasn't holding him to pay off a debt, I was holding him because I bought him, I owned him. And so they would plead guilty to slavery because there was no law against it.
So you basically go from de jure slavery to de facto slavery.
Exactly.
All right.
And this happened to thousands and thousands of African Americans, right up to the beginning of World War II.
Talk to me, you mentioned mining a moment ago. You talk a lot about that in the text, and I was even enlightened about that particular aspect of how they were being used, how they were being enslaved. So when we think of slaves, we think of slaves in the field, picking cotton, et cetera, et cetera. But this really started to turn toward mining enslavement. Talk more about the mining industry in the South.
Well, it was mining and a lot of other sort of heavy industrial, sort of crude industrial enterprises, like mining coal, mining iron ore, cutting timber, harvesting the sap from pine trees to make turpentine, which was a huge business at that time. But what was happening there was that at the end of old slavery, just before the Civil War, there had begun to be capitalists in the South who were experimenting with using slaves in factories and coal mines and industrial settings. And those were the men who, after the Civil War, worked the hardest to recreate this new form of forced labor. And like in the case of I talk a lot about a group of mines on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama, that were owned by U.S. Steel Corp by the time these events occurred. And in those mines, the owners of the mines acquired black men from county jails all across Alabama. They leased thousands of black men directly from the state of Alabama. Over the course of 30 or 40 years, there were tens of thousands of African-American men held there. They lived under incredibly brutal conditions, malnourished, sick. They were whipped every day. Unspeakable scenes of brutality.